Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the co-pastors here at Watershed. Just want to quick shout out to everyone on Facebook and YouTube and out on the patio this morning. I want to start today with kind of a playful story. I think it's playful. I'll let you decide. But I don't know if you saw this past week. There was a video that kind of went viral on TikTok, and it appears to show a boat carrying two men and a woman. And the three people on this boat, they started to encircle and harass a family on a lake called Moses Lake in Washington State. Apparently, the boat being harassed, on this boat, they had hoisted or mounted a pride flag, celebrating Pride Month. And the Post claims that while speeding around their boat, the trio started to give the international salute for hello, with the middle finger, and started to yell and shout out gay slurs, and that's just deplorable. It's wrong. But what happened next is so tasty, because while harassing the boat, all of a sudden the engine for the harassing boat started to sputter, and then there was smoke, and the next thing you know, the darn thing just burst into flames. And now I want to be clear, no one was injured. Everybody had life jackets on, so they all had to jump into the water. But in terms of kind of what, by the way, are you catching the irony of a lake called Moses and a burning boat? I mean, I just want to point that out for a moment. Just let that kind of marinate. But I thought in a series called Pineapple Pizza and Other Things That We Don't Agree On, this might be kind of a relevant way to start. And there's actually more to the story that we'll get to in just a moment. But this series is really about looking at ways and trying to understand ways that we can live with more grace and more purpose in the midst of a season that is unprecedented, right? In terms of how emotionally charged things can be, at least unprecedented, I would argue, in my lifetime. And this series is really about unearthing some things that are hard for all of us to see, biases per se, that we tend to harbor as we try to navigate and negotiate relationships as well as disagreements with one another. In fact, last weekend, Scott kind of leaned into two really, I think, foundational biases, one being something called confirmation bias. And really, confirmation bias just says, I don't want to hear anything that doesn't fit into my meaning-making systems in life. And then he talked a little bit about complexity bias, which sort of says, if you're going to create complexity in my life, I'm going to tap out. I'm going to be resistant. If you've ever seen the bumper sticker, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That bumper sticker kind of embodies these first two biases. Our brains want really simple solutions that already fit into our worldview, and these first two biases really address that reality. And by the way, I know Scott, I think, mentioned this last week, but there's a really insightful podcast that's helped inform this series called Learning How to See. If you haven't downloaded it, I listened to this thing twice back in January and February, and it was really insightful and helpful for myself, as well as me trying to figure out how to navigate some of my relationships. But I want to spend some time this morning unveiling a couple of more biases. And the way I want to get there actually is to lean into a story about Moses from the Old Testament. And more specifically, this sort of conflict that emerges between himself and two of his siblings, Aaron and Miriam. And just to kind of set the scene, the Israelites have already escaped the Egyptians, and they're probably 2 or 3 years wandering in the desert, and things are starting to get really, really hard. They're struggling with food and water and safety, in terms of it being scarce. Where are we going to eat? How are we going to drink? How are we going to stay safe? So things aren't really going well. They've already started to grumble, and in Numbers 12, the grumbling kind of takes a more directed approach where the author writes, Miriam and Aaron began to confront Moses because he had taken a Cushite wife. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? Which sounds really comical. I mean, this is on the backside of Moses announcing 10 plagues and parting a Red Sea, and somehow these people feel like, we should be seen sort of an equal value here. I don't care what you've done, Moses. And the Lord heard this, though, and said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out of the tent of meeting, which is sort of like this makeshift tabernacle that they would carry with them, all three of you. And so the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of clouds. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, actually, there's a little bit of stuff left out there, but God kind of chastises them verbally. But then it says the anger of the Lord burned against them. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became as white as snow. Aaron turned towards her and saw that she had a defiling disease, which is going to be an important phrase here in just a moment. And Aaron said to Moses, "Please, my Lord, I ask you not to hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed." And so Moses cried out to the Lord, "Please, God, heal her. Heal my sister." Now, quite a few things we're seeing here that we're going to get to in just a moment. What's interesting is some particular dynamics of this story that hopefully land close to home for all of us this morning. Namely, you have a family, you have a group of people who are journeying under duress into the unknown, into the wilderness. They're spending every waking moment together. In some instances, in close quarters, in tents, trying to figure out how to procure the most basic needs of life: food, water, safety. And now they find themselves doing this. There's some sort of conflict. That doesn't sound familiar at all right now, right? I mean, the only thing that would make this story a little more relevant is if there was a toilet paper shortage and Charmin started to be raining down from heaven. This is the life, this is the world that we're living in now. I was talking with a block leader this past week that I was catching up with, and they started to describe to me how difficult it's been, how much challenge has been associated with just trying to maintain the relationship with a particular family member, and how over the last few years, because of the growing difference in the political and the social divide, there's been like this stalemate of sorts between them and someone that really was this predictable, sort of sacred, cherished relationship in their life, and how it feels like it's hanging by a thread. How many of you know what I'm talking about? You know, it's possible we all have some sort of family relationship that might be stressed right now, or maybe it's a social relationship or friendship or work relationship. Maybe it's someone that lives in your neighborhood or next door. Maybe there's even space here in Watershed where this is happening between you and someone else. It's just hard, right? There's tension, there's anxiety. And it's hard, I think, for a multitude of reasons, but maybe at a baseline, often it's hard because there's unresolved trauma or insecurities at work and you don't even realize it, or you don't have the capacity to see it. And the thing that is so debilitating about trauma often is how it has a way of zapping your courage and your stamina in the midst of really difficult conversations. And it's like you struggle to stay open. You struggle to have an open heart or an open mind. But in terms of like low levels of courage and stamina, there's actually a bias that sort of speaks into this in terms of how it functions for us. It's something called complementarity bias, which has 6 syllables, and I just owned that like a Harvard law professor. Yeah. Complementarity bias, I've jinxed myself for sure, says that we mirror back the attitude of the people we talk to, and this makes us open or closed to what they have to say, whether it's true or not. In other words, this bias says when someone is pleasant, we're biased to be more open, to see the world the way they see it or what they have to say. But once pleasantries are removed, or we interpret them to be removed, then we shut down. We become closed. We become resistant. Maybe we become even oppositional. And when this starts to happen, everybody gets set up for failure. It creates sort of this binary reality, this either or way of interacting. You know what I'm talking about? Like where you better treat me right You better respect me. You better say it the way I need to hear it, or I'm not going to listen. I'm going to turn away from you. And I think it's important to acknowledge that anytime you can foster some sense of civility or patience in the discourse, like when you can check down on your emotions in hard conversations, like the chances of people seeing one another and understanding one another improve. Like I think we all agree on this, but there's also a bit of an underbelly to this notion as well. I mean, when trauma and pain is involved, like for us to expect someone to keep their emotions at bay, first of all, showing up that way is not very generous. It's not very courageous for me, for instance, if I show up in that space, to ask someone to tell the truth about the way they feel or what they think when there's this undertow at work. In addition, when you begin to live unaware of that bias, then you rob yourself of hearing what's true regardless of how it's delivered. I mean, can we all agree that truth is truth regardless of the tone in which it shows up? Jesus turned over tables in the tabernacle. Like he destroyed property in protest. He called religious leaders vicious names. Viper, serpent, you have a throat, or you have throats like open graves. And I would surmise that in part at least because of complementarity bias within the religious leadership, whose egos were bruised and whose feelings were often disregarded, that in part is what got Jesus on their radar and eventually got him killed. But the underbelly I'm describing here for some folks is even more debilitating, because it doesn't matter often how some people show up, even if it's with a smile or a handshake. Because of race or gender or sexual orientation, the minute there's disagreement or pushback at any level, if you've faced being stereotyped already out of the gate as hostile, dangerous, or irrational, your starting point isn't equal. It's actually unequal. You're having to not only manage your emotions, but the biases and the emotions of the person that you're in front of. And it's like trying to play golf and that person is hitting from like the pro tee, where everyone else is hitting from the kids tee, which is much closer to the green. What's so demoralizing about this bias of this sort is like the message is being sent. Because what's really being said is, I don't care how many times you've been patient or civil. I don't care how many times or how long you've exercised some degree of kindness or restraint, often to no avail. If you can't say it with a smile and a handshake, then we're done. The pain or inequality that you're experiencing is not my problem. That's the subversive message when this complex, this complementarity bias is at work. Not only this, like when that's in play, expecting someone else to be gentle or filtered or, quote, appropriate, right? And can we just be honest here? Within the power dynamics of structure, it's the people with the most power who define what's appropriate, and it's usually down the ladder of authority. To expect someone to be gentle or filtered or appropriate is basically saying, I'm going to disproportionately place the burden to be rescued from my own discomfort on you, the person who has been historically or experientially dismissed or abused or victimized. Whew. That's a lot, isn't it? You know, in the name of transparency, as complementarity bias goes, I think this might be one of the more sinister. At least in terms of how I've observed it functioning over the sort of the spectrum of my life, and really the role and the history and the experience of us as a community. Early on as a teacher and a coach, I worked with young people. I was a student pastor. I have children. And one of the more sobering realities is all the different times where, people who were emotionally still in developmental stages would show up and interact with me in ways that I would say are inappropriate. And instead of like me dealing with the tension of that, often I would put the onus on them, and not only would I dismiss them, but sometimes I would actually like elevate it. Would escalate the emotion or punish them with the type of anger that maybe I'm interpreting that's coming my way. But in the case of Watershed, and again, I think I could speak personally, but then also for our organization, it's kind of sobering because this has functioned within the ecosystem of who we are. There have been times when someone would challenge me on something, and I would interpret that as hostile or unfair. What do you mean Watershed has a problem with patriarchy? I mean, yeah, there's two white guys at the top, but that's just coincidence. What do you mean like white supremacy ideas are sort of unconsciously, subversively encoded in our structures and our ideals and our preferences? What are you talking about? Like, we don't need to interrogate our community, how we do things. It's still hard to hear myself say those, but it also marks how we've started to understand what it means to become healthy. And by no means have we arrived, but I think part of growing up is weeding out the bias of needing something handed to us in a way that's nicely wrapped, that has a real pretty bow, has real pretty packaging, which brings us back to Moses and Aaron and standing in front of Miriam, mortified at what they're seeing, both crying out for her healing. If you were an Israelite, purity codes really mattered. It was like, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, purity codes are what help keep the tribe safe. It often helped provide enough food, enough water, enough safety. But these codes, they had a dark side as well, because they would often be weaponized against people who were declared to be unclean, outsiders. Well, that's really the core conflict of what we see going on here between Moses and his siblings. It's interesting, historians universally agree that Cushites originated from Africa in the region of Ethiopia, which meant Zipporah, which was, it's the name of the woman that historians believe was Moses' wife, the Cushite. Zipporah's skin tone would have been much darker than the average skin tone of the Israelite woman, namely Miriam. Her customs, her hair, her look, her clothing, her language, the food that she ate, the way that she prepared her food, just the way she carried herself would have been vastly different than her siblings in the tribe that had adopted her. Simply put, Zipporah was an outsider and as such was marked unclean. She was an easy target for Israel to cast blame on as the villain of their duress. And in the mind of Miriam and Aaron, of course, she's the problem, and God is upset at Moses for allowing all this to take place. And yet, in verse 10, it says, when the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became white as snow. Then Aaron turned towards her and saw that she had a defiling, an impure skin disease. Again, the irony here is, it's just so divine. This woman, this Zipporah, who is an outcast and unclean, is now in direct contrast with the most powerful, arguably the most powerful woman in the tribe. I mean, she was the sister of Moses. So Moses' mom or her sister, one of those two, like the most powerful woman, is now leprous. She is now labeled as impure. She's now labeled as an outsider. Talk about a turn of events. There's this bias that I think has something to do with this story. It's something called contact bias. And contact bias says if you lack contact with someone, you won't be able to see what they see. And it's just interesting, Moses didn't return to Egypt alone. He showed up with Zipporah. He showed up with his Cushite family. And how many meals must have Aaron, Miriam, and Zipporah had together over the course of their time together in the wilderness? How many tasks must they have performed together? How many miles did they walk as they traipsed through the wilderness? And yet, in the midst of being in such close proximity, in the midst of all these opportunities to really see one another, these two remained trapped in their self-engineered silos of certitude. In other words, proximity really didn't manifest a true seeing between these siblings. By the way, if you had to take some inventory of your relationships right now, who are you in contact with right now in your life, but in reality, you're just not willing to hear or see at all. You're not willing to see nuance. You're not willing to see complexity. Aaron and Miriam had every opportunity because of proximity to be in contact with a person that at the end of it all could have really impacted their way to see reality, to see God, and they didn't. And it's not really clear around the details, in terms of how the relationship may have changed. But one thing is obvious. Miriam now has firsthand experience for what it's like to be an outsider. She understands, at least at an experiential level, of what it's like to be Zipporah, to be a scapegoat, to lose her power, to be outside of the status quo. It says in verse 15, so Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until she was brought back. And I love reading between the lines here because it would make sense that out of this experience, you would hope that contact emerged differently, like the conversation started to change, which I don't think is inconceivable because it says in verse 16, after that experience, after that season, the people left Hazeroth to then encamp in the desert of Paran. In other words, somehow or another, they were able to put this experience in their rearview mirror, and they were together, gave themselves permission to continue on further into the wilderness. And who knows, maybe there was more empathy, more grace, more understanding. Maybe there was a way for them to become more human as well as divine. Maybe. We limit ourselves when we have no stamina in hard conversations. We limit ourselves when we refuse contact with others. But when we can sit with one another with some sense of open-mindedness and open-heartedness, everything starts to shift. Everything starts to get impacted. Empathy, understanding, that begins to grow. Enemies often become humanized, and transformation actually becomes possible. And look, I want to be really careful here because it's not that simple, right? It is not that simple. It's often way more complex, easier said than done. But if some of this feels familiar to you this morning, I didn't want to leave our time together without at least offering a couple of observations that might be helpful in the way that you try to navigate this in your own life with your own relationships. And here's the first thing that I think might be worth reminding ourselves of, and that is the longing to be accepted, loved, and validated is a universal desire. We all kind of long for the face that will not leave us. That's a quote from James Loder. In other words, the longing to be included, to be affirmed and supported is one of at least a few really intense common denominators that we all share. It's why I think Jesus insisted that loving one's neighbor as oneself was so important. He didn't say love your neighbor. He said love your neighbor in a way that like you're offering out of your place of longing what you can offer to someone that you're trying to love in front of you. But my experience has been that within conflict, there's often like this undertow of fear in a relationship because it feels like this relationship, if it's been the place of fulfillment for a longing, if that's in jeopardy, whether it's named or not, that can be intense. And so it's really easy to stay trapped in that fear. It's really easy to stay, unaware of what's happening for you and this other person, but to acknowledge this in yourself, to let that work on you, I think that's important. Another way of saying this is it possible in relationships to detach from the emotionality of the experience and to do this as a way of trying to see the other person? Is it possible for you to take ownership or control of your feelings instead of allowing your feelings to take control of you? The longing to be accepted, loved, and validated is a universal desire. This too, within the first few months of our son Mez coming to us, we have 3 children. All 3 are adopted internationally. And Mez came to us later on in life, around 5.5 years, from Ethiopia, ironically. But a few months into it, he broke his arm for the first time. And the risk of stating the obvious, in order for a broken bone to heal, it has to be immobilized, right? And casts, as uncomfortable as they are, they create the necessary environment because of their limitations and the space that they give for that bone to, or for the body actually, to heal the bone. And I think this is a helpful image for where we are in relationships with one another, with family and friends and loved ones. Something has been broken. There's a fracturing of sorts. And often, I think, if you're like me, there's like this self-imposed pressure to skip over all of the awkwardness and the time and the elephants under the rug and everything in between that you have to deal with, and just jump straight to, all right, let's reconcile this, let's define it, and let's move on. And I just don't think that's realistic. In fact, I'm pretty convinced of it at this point. I think our relationships almost need to take on like a metaphorical cast. And what I mean by this is, in order to give the relationship the space that it needs, limits may need to be implemented. You can still love someone and set boundaries. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can still love someone and you can opt out on particular topics or environments, conversations or experiences, and not as a way of cutting someone out of your life permanently, but just creating space and allow something to evolve in the midst of that space that's been broken. Space and time for it to heal. And will it be comfortable? No. Will it be received well? Probably not. Right? And you'll have to learn how to become comfortable with the uncomfortable, essentially. Something our family's working through right now. Will the relationship die anyway? I don't know. Part of, I think, the work that we have to go through is letting go of the control, the illusion of control, that somehow we can white knuckle this this relationship into the place that we want it to go. But the truth is that you or someone else, there's very little in terms of how we control the willingness of somebody else to change or to be ready to change, for that matter. And it's scary because everything. There's no way to predict any of that, right? So it's a bit terrifying. But I think making the decision and committing to, all right, this is what I can participate in, and this is what I can't, and this is how I can, offer my energy, my time, my resources. That's a type of love. That's a type of faith. It's a way of saying, I love you enough, friend from high school or parent or aunt or uncle. I love you enough to try to create some space and see if something different can happen between us. And then lastly, when it comes to dealing with others, we're in such a volatile place in our world. In the process of confronting suffering and injustices and abuse in this world, I think there's a particular type of strength and courage that's needed. But I also think there's this great need for like this peculiar type of love, a love that's radical, a love that's creative or innovative, and even a little mischievous, which is a great opportunity to check back in on our friends who were treading water when we first started this story. If you were like me, when you heard this story, like you were dying to know what happened, right? Like particularly, how did the boat with the flag respond to the people who had been tormenting them? I mean, did they just kind of be like, well, sucks to be you, and drove off? Did they do that? No judgment if they did that, right? Or did maybe they like a shark circling fresh prey? You know, they just start rotating and going, give them a little dose of their own medicine and, you know, salute them and give them, you know, quite a few choice words. Did they do that? No, they didn't do either of those, actually. Instead, they chose to pull their perpetrators, their persecutors out of the water and transport them back to dry land. Oh, this is so sweet. This is just priceless. And it's not because it was the morally right thing to do. Again, you do whatever you want in that situation. I'm not going to judge you, apart from like causing harm or whatnot. And it's not because it was like the kind thing to do, you know? No. It's because in this choice, I think there was a type of love that was put on display. A type of love where essentially the people in the boat said, we're actually going to show up with mercy, with generosity, with grace that's undeserving, you know? But in doing so, we're going to force you to be in contact with us in a way that you would have never engineered yourself. And it may not have changed these people in the moment. In fact, if you watch the video, it kind of is clear that it didn't. And it may not have changed them, you know, in the future for that matter. But what it did was it forced them to engage these people as people. It invited them to humanize the people that they felt the power to taunt and vilify just minutes before God rained down fire on their boat. You know? If you need to hear this from a greater place of authority, the Bible actually speaks into this. In fact, in Proverbs 25, 21 and 22, it says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. If his boat catches fire and he's been an a-hole, give him a lift to dry land. Right? And in doing so, or in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. That's from the Gilligan's Island translation, just for the record. By the way, happy Pride Month, right? Is that just a great way to celebrate this once again? So friends, this morning, in the midst of our own biases, in the midst of our own disagreements, may we remind one another, may we remind each other that there is a shared longing between all of us, the longing to be loved and validated, a universal desire. And that for now, and in a state of brokenness, maybe some casts around relationships, some boundaries might be the most loving response to a person that you're at odds with. And may we also love in scandalous, creative, and mischievous ways as we rescue people out of water and commute them to dry land. God, this morning, we're just, first of all, thank you. Sometimes I wonder if you're real, and then a story like this happens, and I'm going, I don't know how you're not real. But God, may we learn, not just out of stories in the news circle, but in the way that we come together, in the way that we interact, not just with ourselves, but the relationships. Conflict can teach us something. And it can also be a gateway to liberation. And so that not just one group of people are liberated, but those of us with biases also get liberated. We love you, God. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Have a great day, and I hope I see you over at Petty Thieves.